So apologies. I will move that we accept the apologies from Mayor David Cull and Councillor Stedman. And Newell, yep. Thank you. Seconded, Andrew Wiley, Councillor Wiley. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Confirmation of the agenda. I'll move that the committee confirms the agenda with the following addition or alteration. In regard to Standing Order 2.1, Option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments, and that Item 6, Startup Ecosystem, be taken before Item 5 to allow members of the Startup Dunedin Trust to be present. Seconded, Councillor Wiley. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Declarations of interest. I assume they haven't changed since our last meeting, so I will move that the committee notes the elected members' interest register and confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests. Seconded, Councillor Wiley. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. So that brings us to Item 6. Welcome to the table, Chanel. Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
The floor is yours.
I think the floor will be Ms. O'Brien's.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. There are 3 points that I'd like to raise just in introducing this report. Firstly, the development of the startup ecosystem is a key initiative of the Grow Dunedin Partnership and Enterprise Dunedin, and that we would like to recommend that the committee approves $150,000 in funding to the Startup Dunedin Trust for the 2019-20 financial year from proposed 2019-20 Grow Dunedin Partnership operating budgets. Secondly, we're satisfied with the performance of the Startup Dunedin Trust to date and the calibre of Donna Hall and the team who are implementing the Trust's purpose, which is to be instrumental in the success of 21 new companies in Dunedin, each employing more than 21 people by 2021. Donna touched on some of the achievements in the 2018 and 19 year, and I'll just touch on a couple. The launch of the Challenger series, which attracted 72 applications, 20 pitches, and 3 internationally active startups ready for growth. The Audacious Student Challenge, which has over 20 students ready to pitch and 10 potentially entering into the final stages in the next few days. Startup Weekend, which has had the best participation to date, with 63 individuals and 9 teams formed, and 3 of those teams continuing on with their ideas, and a network of mentors and investors in progress. Thirdly, we're building on the service level agreement and the KPIs for the Trust for 2019-20. The KPIs have been received by the Trust and will form part of a service level agreement for 2019 and 20. This will be the basis under which we'll manage, measure and provide access for DCC funders to invest in the future development of the startup ecosystem. They're based on objectives which are agreed to by partners and the Trust, and the proposed KPIs will focus on things like quality events, where a proportion of Trust events attendees will include women, youth and seniors, Māori and Pacifica, migrants and international students. Program completion, such as Challenger and co-starters, etc. We want to know if people have found the content and support to be relevant and useful. Did it help validate or pivot their idea? The work around mentors, support and advice. The KPIs will seek to grow the proportion of startups that directly receive considerable contact through mentorship, support and advice. And we want to know if people's thinking has been challenged and has it made a difference. And investors, income and employment. What proportion of startups were getting subsidies or investment? And was this assistance crucial to their momentum? Are startups generating revenue and employment? So we're looking forward to advising Council of progress in the future based on these sort of KPIs in 2019 and 20, and we thank the Trust for their ongoing work.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Vanders.
On page 29, in terms of advantages for the preferred option for $150,000, it says at the end that it provides a platform to build on additional work streams such as the Centre for Digital Excellence and support development of talent startups to growth Dunedin's technology and creative sectors. Build on additional work streams. Does this mean that the $150,000 is going to go towards paying the salary of an extra employee, or where in your budget, what have you budgeted this $150,000 actually for?
Thank you, Councillor Vandervis. The resources that we put aside, or that we're proposing for the Startup Trust, is people resource within the trust. So it's the roles such as Donna Hall, or associated with Angus Pauley, who's also within the trust, because they deliver the services around which we're talking about, whether or not it's audacious or co-starters or other activities. The final bullet point, when it contextualises code within the ecosystem, is that there will be a relationship between the Centre of Digital Excellence and the wider ecosystem that actually is in place. So we acknowledge that. That was just simply an acknowledgement that the Centre of Digital Excellence will operate within a wider startup ecosystem, and there will probably be a relationship between two parts in terms of working with companies or delivering services.
Given that we already have some very good staff and they've presented very well today, can you not tell me what the $150,000 is specifically for?
The $150,000 is actually investing in those staff at the Startup Dunedin Trust.
So it's to pay those staff
Correct.
wages into the future?
Correct.
And currently that's unbudgeted?
Correct.
Sorry, I should have perhaps picked that up from the paperwork, but it wasn't entirely clear. So thank you for clarifying. Cheers.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, and apologies if I've missed this, but in terms of the additional investment from Callaghan that's being attracted as a result of this, which was $50,000 in the current financial year and $25,000 in the next, is that reflective of a change of their priorities in terms of what they're supporting, or can you expand on what's changed there?
That funding is actually up until December 2019. So we're going to be engaging for an RFP bid for further funding for the Startup Trust in relation to developing incubation services going beyond December 2019.
Sorry, so the 25k from Callaghan is from July 1 to December of this
That's right, yes.
calendar year?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
It was actually more or less my question, but it does lead into my next one, which I asked again during the public forum. Callaghan has its main service office in Christchurch, and it would have been argued that for a long time maybe this area didn't warrant Callaghan's investment of an actual office in Dunedin because there weren't that many startups here. But it's been my experience dealing with actually with the rising tide thing that only 4 years ago they had almost no applicants for that kind of grant, and now there were like 40 for it, so they're seeing massive amounts of growth. So my question is, are you seeing that level of growth in these startups? And then secondly, is it time now for the government to actually start paying attention and actually put their money where their mouth is in terms of tech investment and get an office in this region? Obviously from a staff perspective.
Thank you. From a staff perspective, we are seeing good growth in terms of the skills and the talent that has been picked up through a lot of these startups. The latest Infometrics report, or the most recent Infometrics report, pointed to the growth in technical and professional trades within the city, or jobs within the city, which we think there's a correlation between the activity of what's happening within the business community in terms of the nature of those roles. Anecdotally, and from what we're picking up also from the agencies such as Startup Dunedin Trust, is that we are seeing good growth. I think Mr. Mason mentioned when he was talking around the number of actual co-working spaces within the city, how that has actually grown certainly over the last 2 to 3 years, and I think that is also testament both in terms of the growth of the co-working spaces, but the number of businesses inside those co-working spaces that the ecosystem is looking strong and positive within that space. In terms of engaging with Wellington and also with agencies, we're continually having those conversations. I think it's partly on us to actually tell those stories of what is actually happening within the city and seeing whether or not we can actually maximise more support within the city in terms of resources, whether or not it's a presence here or opening up more channels such as through Creative HQ or other sources of support.
Councillor Wilson.
Sorry, just taking that question of the 150 plus the 50, and it doesn't worry me, but I just want to be clear when I'm reading these reports. If I look at paragraph 8, you talk about the 50,000 last grant from Callaghan, and I can't remember where I saw it with the 25 for this time, but I just want to check, is it 25 new, or is it actually budgeting for 25 from the past 50 that we're talking about in those lines? Because, and with the prospect of another 25 maybe in the next financial year.
Sure. Look, paragraph 8 refers to the
past?
18-19 year up to 30 June this year.
Okay.
Yep, so paragraph 8 is in reference to funded activity up to
Including
30 June.
including B for Callaghan?
Correct. So the $150,000 that council invested last year was drew additional investment through Callaghan of 50,000. For this year though, it's only a part year, hence why 50,000 is at 25,000.
Yep.
It's only for 2 quarters as opposed to for 4 quarters for 19.
So it is 75, that's fine. It's odd, thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. This is just a question on point number 12. On 28th of March, the Grow Dunedin Partnership resolved to allocate 150,000 from a proposed operating budget of 360,000. So the budget is already there in the Grow Dunedin Partnership.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, it is. We have a Grow Dunedin Partnership budget, and they have prioritised this and the film projects for council consideration under the delegations that they have.
So that means it's budgeted already. It's not as though we're pulling more out of our own budget.
That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you. This is a bit of a left field question, but in terms of taking into account that this is going to provide continuity of those staff and the Startup Trust continuing the great work they're doing, I attended, it's Tech Week this week, of course, as you know, and I attended, as does Ms O'Brien, the MedTech event last night for Tech Week. And there was a lot of discussion from a quality panel about the importance of MedTech in Dunedin and the relationship to the new hospital. Would you see the Startup Trust as having an important part to play in that, and therefore the continuity of their work is going to be important going forward?
Thank you, Councillor Gary. Yes, I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of activity around the digital transformation work relating to the hospital rebuild, and through that, the Startup Trust, I envisage, will see a number of opportunities that they can start to progress, really. Certainly the strengths, as talked about last night at that discussion, was around education and health, but health in particular being an area that Dunedin is particularly strong in, the medical school, the hospital rebuild, biomedical sciences, the medical sciences and so forth, and the university and the polytechnic with particular strengths there. So there's probably, it would be unusual if the Startup Dunedin Trust didn't see opportunities within the medtech space. It's a difficult space. It's an unknown space in many ways, and we're early stages in getting to grips with what it might mean. I think a number of the panellists indicated that this is still new, but it's a focus that I'm certain the Trust will start to look at, and there'll be no doubt startups that will start to emerge through potentially the university and the Polytech that will funnel through startup trust activities and their programs to perhaps take advantage of some of those opportunities.
Thank you for that clarification.
Councillor Lord. Councillor Elder.
Sorry, I forgot to ask the second question. Thank you, Chair. Chanel, you've been around Dunedin for a while, and if you think back to 5 years ago or 10 years ago compared to now, what would you say the vibe is in the startup space as compared?
Well, everyone keeps telling me that we're on the cusp of something. I've been hearing that for a long time. I would have to say that it's been perhaps one of the most encouraging spaces I've worked in, because we're actually getting traction and momentum, and it's because I think we have such a strong and focused group of people in the Startup Trust who are actually providing the impetus to really develop something quite special and unique here in the city. And I mean, to give credit to the economic development strategy, which is providing the framework for that to happen, and also you know, the support and encouragement of Greater Dunedin Partnership and the team at Enterprise Dunedin, I think has been hugely satisfying for me to see that starting to emerge. And it's all about, you know, building trust and confidence and enabling people in Dunedin to feel that there is an opportunity for them to do something special and different and to take their ideas forward through a system such as we've got going now with the startup ecosystem. So I think yes, we are on the cusp of something. What it is remains to be seen, but we're hoping that in the next 12 months we'll see a bit more momentum and a bit more activity and more growth in that space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Wiley, you indicated you wished to move. Seconded Councillor Gary. Debate. Councillor Wiley.
Option one. I think everybody could really get a vibe of this paper from the leadership that the Startup Dunedin Trust brought to the table in the forum. I think when you look, and the question, following on from Councillor Elder's question, talking about the vibe, I think pre-Gig City and the whole Gig campaign, and you turned up some of those startups meetings and things like that, you know, there was a lot going on. It didn't quite connect. Now there's connections, there's a real energy at those events, and it really continues across. And it really does not matter whether you're 50 and starting your third business, or whether you're 18 and starting your first business. Every one of those in that room is taken as being important. And it's really great to see the smart minds and the new minds working together with greater energy. So the first thing I want to do is I want to urge any of my councillor colleagues that haven't attended Foundex, which is actually on tonight, as you heard, Startup Weekend, Audacious, Rising Tide, or any other great events, to actually go and see what's happening, what's being pitched. There are some incredible things happening. Just walk into Petri Dish, Innovate HQ, and you'll see this actually happening in the city. So the big part is we've got to really, invest more in this. I'd love to see a greater fund than 150,000, but the key thing is that we are getting a lot of bang for our buck out of this. But the part that I really look at, and I get frustrated with this time and time again, I think the council can really show some real leadership in this space by opening their doors and sometimes opening their minds to some of the talents that are coming out of these startup spaces and saying, you know what, we could actually adapt or utilise some of these skills within our operations. And that would be the one plea that we actually turn around and say, and I'd love to see us do our own startup weekend where we actually put council on the table and said to these young minds, we'll put some money, we'll put some skin in the game on the table, come to our startup weekend and show us how we can improve a lot of things. But more importantly, let's just approve what's on the screen in option 1, and let's worry about my other thoughts later. Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
This is a report that I'm happy to see, because I think you'll remember a year ago when I commented on this that I'd be looking quite carefully at what came out of it, and I want to say that I feel that this current 12 months activity has been very positive. I've seen startup initiatives for a good 15 years in 2 countries, and they are notorious for consuming money and delivering nothing. And this is showing real signs of delivery here. I do think it's meeting a activity in the city that actually the city of the past can almost claim for. Looking at the statistic of the average age of the startups and the returns, I'm one of those people. I'm clearly over 40. And I did return deliberately back to Dunedin because of the environment Dunedin had when I was a student, and that attracted me back here. And I think that when we consider our economic development, maybe to Councillor Fiso's comment, it's not just putting money into startups, it's creating a city to live in. And I think this all fits in together. And what I see coming out of this is that when those people are now wanting to start up businesses, this startup environment is helping them get going. I do want to then now extend a challenge to the central government. It is time for them to look at Dunedin and recognise that we are one of the 4 regional centres, and that it's not sufficient to just supply one set of support to the South Island in one city, that Dunedin needs to be also given that level of input. Because from my own personal perspective, there is still a difficulty of interacting with government. And as much as we do a good job here, you are always at a disadvantage when you're going through an intermediary. And it would be far better to see them here. So I support this. I think it's about the right level of funding for a while. We might want to invest that in a couple of years to see again. And now I would also then implore the central government to follow up with our success and come in and put their money in here too. Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. I support 150,000 spent in the startup space. Talking to an enthusiastic young man who had just pitched to the Startup Challenger Series, he could not say enough about the startup ecosystem in Dunedin. He feels there's a real vibe in the city for the young and the not so young entrepreneurs. Our startup spaces, including the Distiller Innovate HQ, Petri Dish, and I've forgotten the name of the other one, Regis, are providing exceptional support and mentoring, and the co-working spaces are providing peer support, encouragement and cheaper rental for startups. Distiller is for free, and there's many young people working out of there. So free rent, free advice, and a play it forward ecosystem in Dunedin where Farah Engineering does parts for free while someone's starting up. JTech out at Mosgiel doing parts for free while people are starting up. And some of the advice is for free, play it forward, and if you succeed, pay the bill afterwards. Those are all the kind of things people need when they're starting up. And I just think this young man actually is from Auckland, and he says Dunedin's got the best startup place he's seen. And I would like to congratulate the Economic Development Unit and the startup employees for the wonderful work they've done, and all the other co-starters spaces that are doing a fantastic job. Petri just provides free space until people are set up, and they also provide free advice as well. So it's just fantastic. May it go strong.
Councillor Fiso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the staff for your ongoing work and your energy in terms of trying to care for our people. I'm torn about this, and I'm wondering if I should abstain. I really do. do think that startup is doing a really good job with the resources they have. Quite frankly, my bias comes from coming from a neighbourhood where the percentage of young people not in employment, not in education, not in training has always been higher than the regional average. I note that there was, you know, a 0.4 or 0.5 percent decrease in unemployment here in the city, but the national average is 4%, not 6%. So, and I'm really encouraged by the optimism that people, and not just in the startup space, feel about our economic future. But I still feel for the people who are in need or in despair, who are not actually able to access opportunities provided by the great work that Startup Trust is doing. Kia ora.
Before I give Councillor Wiley his right of reply, I think the position we're at now with incubation of startups is the strongest we have been in our history. We took a bit of a risk, I guess, when Upstart decided to merge into Christchurch, and there was some funds left in the kitty that we had a proposal pitched to us to start something at the university and put in place some trustees to run it. And I have to say, we did that, and in the first year, certainly in the first year, we thought this is really just a big hole in the ground into which we've tipped $200,000. But good things do take a little bit of time, and I think in this case we hung in there, and in fact the Trust struggled with funding for a period. Out of that came some passion and drive, and I think what we have now is a very much stronger ecosystem with some passionate people at the front end of it, getting people into the system, providing that opportunity. Then we've got the Innovates and Creative HQs that are picking these people up and taking them through another stage. I think the big issue for us coming up is that angel funding, getting the confidence, a network in place and the confidence amongst those people who are prepared to invest in what is high risk, startup companies, to get them up through to a point where they can really demonstrate they've got a product that is going to attract people like banks and other institutional investors. So I think they've done great work, and I certainly support this, and I would hope that it's supported in the coming 2 or 3 years, and I definitely agree with the comments made by Councillor O'Malley that it's time, we're building that inertia, it's time for the government to recognise, and maybe the code initiative, provided it gets signed off, which I'm sure it will create that extra bit of momentum that might get them to start to consider a greater investment here in that innovation and startup space. Councillor Wiley, your right of reply.
Thank you. I just want to touch on just one thing really quickly in regards to Councillor Lafiso. I think it'd be great to, whether Councillor Elder or myself, take you to Petri Dish and to see what, in some of these events, whether it's Audacious and Rising Tide, and see that when you see these students or even adults in action, they're really tackling a lot of the issues we consistently talk about here at the council table and actually have an impact across the whole city and not just the downtown core. There's some amazing thinking that I'd hate to even go into because it really does cover everyone. And we're not, I see these real strong social incubation type of projects or new projects that really are starting to expose themselves. And again, the big problem is most of them aren't getting enough funding. So that's where I really look at saying, let's support this and let's support it so the whole community will benefit across our city. Thank you.
Okay, councillors, I'm going to put it. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Now we move on to item 5. So, yep. Just waiting for the changeover. Okay, I'm led to believe you want to go straight to questions.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Gary.
Thank you. I've got several questions. The first one is page 16, item 8, the Otago Regional Economic Development Framework. How long have we been working on this for?
Probably we're into May now, aren't we? Probably close to 12 months. 12
months. Thank you. Second question is page 18, and it's around Film Dunedin, but oh, I do see he's just walked back in. I had a couple of questions around film, and I noticed that the permits were up slightly. I'm interested to know, Mr. Deaker would presumably be the one to answer this. In terms of inquiries, I presume that's been growing and then that would lead into permits, and those two things might necessarily equate, but I assume that the inquiries are growing. How did we progress in terms of growing this area?
Thank you, Councillor. We've been really successful at building relationships within the industry at those key points, such as the producers, such as the scouts, and in particular with the inquiries office at the New Zealand Film Commission. So all of those elements have contributed to a big step up in the number of inquiries that we're dealing with into the city about looking at filming here.
And what feedback do you get from people applying for permits around the process? Have we made some improvements in that process?
Thank you. Yes, we've been able to develop a really good reputation for ease of business, and it's not just our office; it's been the whole of council. And I want to acknowledge colleagues in transport and parks and property who have been really awesome to work with, proactive. We're looking for solutions, and we've been able to be fast. And that's crucial. The film industry is repeatedly last minute and changes again, and so without that all of council ability to respond quickly, we wouldn't be able to accommodate the projects that are coming in and are lining up to come in.
Thank you. And my final question is on page 19, a compelling destination, the bed nights. This might be for Mr. Christie. It talks about the accommodation occupancy rates. In terms of the current or into the winter season, what are we anticipating there with levels of activity and so forth that's happening in the city?
It's a little bit hard to predict, but I understand from talking to some industry players that this winter is looking pretty soft in terms of forward bookings. That can change quite quickly. What we are looking at doing is running a number of campaigns to try to spread both the shoulder season for tourism, which typically does make the winter more challenging, and to look at other activities such as events. Obviously the work that's being done around film is all designed to try to encourage bed nights at the time of year when we're not experiencing high visitor numbers. So it's about trying to get best use for those beds, those resources that we have across a number of different portfolios.
Councillor Vanders.
Going back to the question that I started this meeting asking at the wrong place, there is a graph on page 22 which shows Dunedin unemployment still stubbornly almost exactly 50% higher than the national average. The unemployment issue here, I've had anecdotal evidence of people wanting to get jobs here and those jobs simply not being available. Very skilled people getting jobs, for instance, at the university, but their partners not being able to get jobs. And I recognise that this has been a very long-term issue. And I'm wondering if you have any plans to address the issue and why it is that we really are so far behind the national average in the unemployment status.
Can I, looks like we're about to fight over the microphone, Councillor Vandervis, in terms of a response. Can I introduce Mr. Benji Patterson, who is providing business analyst support for us within Enterprise Dunedin. And I can't hold back such enthusiasm to answer a question, so I'll hand over to Mr. Patterson. And
Buck, nicely passed.
Do you think it was good?
Sorry, Fraser, I thought you were turning on the microphone for me.
I was.
Very good. Thank you, Councillor. Look, I can answer the second part of your question as to what's happening in at present in terms of the differences between Otago's unemployment rate and the national average. So it has been a long-standing issue that that unemployment, or at least jobs growth in Dunedin, has lagged the national average. Over recent times, that jobs growth in Dunedin has begun to pick up, but at the same time, Dunedin's been grappling with a structural change in the economy, and you see that quite evident in some of the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector that has continued to occur over recent years. On the positive side of the ledger, there has been some quite strong jobs creation in the professional services, and some of those are concentrated in ICT, as Fraser already alluded to. We're also seeing as a byproduct of population growth that there's demand on services such as education and health. So employment in those sectors is picking up, as well as in the retail sector. Another thing that I'd like to point out that ties in with what Anthony was up here talking about is we are also seeing some job creation that is in industries that is related to the film sector. So in the performing arts and in hair and beauty, there's been some job creation there as well.
Right, I understand there have been some positives, but the 50% higher unemployment rate here, you're saying, is largely down to the hollowing out of manufacturing.
That's been one of the key detractors from jobs in Dunedin over recent years, and structural changes in an economy is something that takes quite a bit of time to get over. And I guess this is a comment I've made previously before I was here in media, in that the silver lining for those that have lost employment from Dunedin's manufacturing sector is that they haven't been thrown into the cauldron of a recession, that there's been very strong jobs growth in other parts of the economy, but that doesn't help in that's something that provides opportunities over the long term. That transition into new employment can be difficult in terms of if there's a mismatch between your skills and what the market is demanding.
Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley and then Councillor Elder.
Just a population question. I notice page 23, you're using a surrogate because we don't have probably no one has a census data at the moment. And you look at about a 1.9% population increase, assuming that the people who enrol for primary health care are some reflection of population. And I think last year it was 1.8%. So are we seeing effectively a sustained and as of yet non-slowing down increase in the rate of population growth in the city?
Again, it looks like Mr. Patterson's very keen to answer this one, but I'd simply say 3 years, I understand, makes a trend, and I understand that it's very positive, but Benji may want to elaborate on
To
that?
be honest, I wouldn't actually add a lot more to it, other than that the indicators that I've been seeing all suggest that population growth has been sustained. And when you begin to, the census will, when it eventually comes out, shed more light. But from what I've seen of administrative data sets, health records are an example of one health administrative data set. From what I've seen across the board, it's showing that this growth has occurred, and that some of it is down to people moving from other parts of New Zealand is also what we're seeing in the data, including Auckland.
Councillor Elder.
On the topic of growth, there's also predicted to be a huge growth in tourism across the next few years. And I was just related to that occupancy rate, where the queries coming in for the development of new motels, hotels, etc., to reach that demand.
I could probably answer that one. I think we're constantly talking with hotel chains around new opportunities. You will have read about 2 boutique hotels that are obviously one construction completed and one in construction phase. There are other larger hotel chains also looking at Dunedin for viability, but that's going to come down to that business case stacking up depending on the level of accommodation they're providing.
Thank you. The other question was, in March 2019, you put a 15-page in the Herald supplement dedicated to Dunedin, which is fantastic. I was just wondering if there was any queries coming out of that advertising.
So what we'll be doing is we have directed, or that campaign has been supported through content and telling our story through our website. So we're monitoring visitation, and that's really the only robust metric that we can use, other than general inquiries. But a lot of this partnership in terms of the LIVE proposition for Dunedin has been done in partnership with the Southern District Health Board, the university, and also the real estate agents, because they're keen to be able to tell that wider story. So we've leveraged off in a partnership in this space.
Cool, thank you. And the other question I was, Study Dunedin, we've got the numbers there. Is that an increase from last year, or?
Oh, in the table.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Councillor, I'll have to come back to you on that one.
Sorry, I was just wondering what the trend was. That was
no,
all.
that's fair call.
Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you. I've got 2 more questions. The first one is, both on page, this one on page 24, and it's around visitor spend, domestic and international, and overall visitor spend. And I note very pleasingly that they're all up by a considerable percentage, which is great. Would somebody in the team have any comment to make to expand on those figures of visitor spend?
Can you define the question a little bit more in terms of?
So I'm noting I'm noting the visitor spend figures on page 24, and I just wondered if you would have any further comments, or anyone else in the team might have some further comments on that in terms of what they've observed over the last year. Trends.
So, I mean, what it's indicating is that we are getting, in terms of the data sets that we're using, we're able to track that we are seeing growth regarding the spend, and there is other information behind this particular data set that shows a breakdown by the kind of spend, and that is around whether it's accommodation and or attractions or transport. So I think the key thing is that visitor spend is a broader sense of spend in terms of value to the economy in the various sectors. So whilst we capture it through this particular data set, it has a wider reach in terms of various businesses or different economies enjoying that growth.
Thank you. And my second question is around international students, and it's a question for Mr. Christie. We've got some figures there for international students, and I know that you've been to China recently. The page I'm referring to is page 21. In terms of March 15th and the events, the tragic events of March 15th, what was the feedback you got, and what were the messages that you gave, and what kind of feedback did you get from parents and agents?
So it certainly was raised throughout China in two locations in particular, Qingyuan, where we have a lot of student short stay visits to New Zealand and teacher training. That was highlighted there as being of particular concern to them, and we were able to provide the assurance along with the similar messages that we've been getting from government agencies and the Prime Minister herself, that was a one-off event that's not typical of the behaviour we'd expect in New Zealand, and that assurance seemed to be well received by those markets, and the agents in particular have indicated that feedback is very positive, so we'd expect to see continuing levels of activity out of Qingyuan as we have had to date. Beijing was also particularly concerned about those events, and again we were able to give that assurance, which was very timely from our perspective, to ensure that the students and the parents that were sending their students knew that they would be looked after in this city, and that we would be able to, as best we can, ensure that their educational needs were well met.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, I just had a question. I'm not sure if Fraser or John's the person to address it to, but I was just thinking a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago perhaps now, we had Anadarko drilling offshore for gas, and I know at that stage the Economic Development Unit was supportive of dealing with them, and I just know there's also an indication by OMV that they're going to drill later in the year or early next year, and I'm just wondering if you've been doing any work with them at all, any contact?
Not to my knowledge. We keep an obvious ear to the ground in terms of what's happening, and if requests are made of us, we provide information, data to them along with any other businesses. So we would just treat them like any other company that would come to us, and it would be depending on the needs that they have as to how we'd respond. But to my knowledge, we haven't had much engagement at all.
So there's been no change from how you would, for example, have treated Anadarko a few years ago?
No change from our perspective.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Just a quick question, Fraser and Suze. When we look at page 20, we look at the events, business events and conferences. That looks like a really strong result in what's going, especially the increase in days. I take it that's across the board, but working with DVML and their team as well.
That is an output for the whole of the city, across the whole stable of event venues. And
the different conference organisers in the city as well. So it's an overall report of the conference.
So it is the sector, and there is a strong network, which is, from Enterprise Dunedin's perspective, provides the Dunedin Convention Bureau in support.
Cool. The other question I had was on page 24, just following up on the domestic visitor spend and the increase there, and the international. So that's taken from March 1st last year through to February 2019. So that would encompass the whole Ed Sheeran weekend and everything else.
So yes, the answer is yes, it does include Ed Sheeran. The only thing being is that the Easter weekend in 2018 bridged both March and April, so there may be. So
it's
I think
February, end of February, though. So
you've got, therefore, you won't have. So then we wouldn't. Sorry, I think you said March. So
it'd be March 1st, 2018 to February 28th, 2019.
So therefore, it won't include the Ed Sheeran. If that's what you're saying. So Ed Sheeran was in March
2/18.
2018. Oh, I see.
Yes,
Sorry.
Yeah, 1st of March. Yeah.
Yeah. So it will include include that.
Perfect. Thank you. And we see on the screen the dashboard and the insights that are being now produced. How's that being interacted with around the community? And because there's a lot of key data there, which is really starting to tell a very good story.
Okay. So this particular project is a direct action from the Dunedin Destination Plan. And so there are two dashboards. There is the Dunedin Insights, which looks across the broad portfolio that Dunedin, Enterprise Dunedin delivers on, and then there's the visitor dashboard as well, because there's another level of data available. We are socialising it and sending out comms and updates when there's information available for updates. And to be clear, the frequency does vary for different data sets, but we are updating at least monthly, and we are tracking engagement through the website. We used to field a number of inquiries where people would want to know about developing business cases. So as our first port of call in terms of data, we're recommending that they reference this particular data set. And the other thing too is that we're not developers of the data. It is a portal for sharing the collective information to help inform decision making and checking and monitoring our progress in terms of delivery to economic development, strategy, outcomes and projects.
Councillor Gary, you indicated you wish to move.
Yes, I'd like to move that we note the Enterprise Dunedin Activity Report.
You have a question. Okay.
Sorry, I don't think it's been asked, but I may be wrong. The building consents, both under the business to work and to live, that's done by number as opposed to value, is it? And the more meaningful figure would be by value, presumably?
Anybody that wanted to look at further information, you can actually drill down and get value through the Infometrics data set as well. So this is it is an interactive tool, so you can actually drill down and see if you look on the right hand side.
Yeah, no, but I think the question is why it's by number and not by value in the first place.
So we at the time, this is a trial for 6 months, so I can take that back into the forum, and we can talk about what is a more robust metric to be reporting back on.
Yeah, building consents, which may be for residential, I think 448 carports as opposed to 448 new houses. Well, carports I don't think now are included, but that's, yeah. Thank you.
Just so we're clear, there are dashboards behind this in terms of providing more detail.
Councillor Fiso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a similar question regarding unemployment. So the 1.1% increase, you can drill down to try and see where that's happening?
Can we go there?
So.
Sorry, Councillor Fesso, so there was, can we drill down into the unemployment rates by area, was that right?
Or
by measurement?
Young people, that kind of
absolutely. With unemployment, unfortunately, your ability to interrogate below the headline is limited on a regular basis, and that's simply because unemployment nationally is collected as part of a survey, and at a high level it can be broken down into regions using some of the outcomes and benefits data. One of the best ways though of looking at outcomes that matter from a perspective of people that are in vulnerable situations with regards to their attachment to the labour market is to get data out of MSD that can be broken down by ethnicity and into even finer areas. So it's possible to ask questions in that way.
So if you were the Prime Minister, would you follow that approach in terms of drilling down to that data?
Well, MSD actually does release some of that data on their website, so it's possible to get access to it. So the government does take that seriously. It's when unemployment is reported on as an unemployment rate, they're trying to adhere to international methods of talking about unemployment, and that sort of narrows how they can define it.
No more questions? Councillor Gary.
Yes.
So you've moved.
I've moved, yes.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Wiley.
And speaking to the motion, what strikes me about this report is the breadth of activity that has taken place in this quarter, in the period since the last report. And not only the breadth of activity, but the depth of it as well, and the outcomes for our city. There's a great deal of positivity in here in all areas. It's a very compelling read. And I feel that the staff have obviously been working extremely hard on this, and I just want to acknowledge the efforts and the successes. Clearly there's still a great deal more work to do, but we see that everything from the trip to China and the impact for a variety of reasons, but the impact of reassuring families who are thinking of sending their students here is important. We've been talking about startup and the new businesses that are coming to our city, and we're looking at economic growth and job growth, and we know that's very important to our community. The encouraging thing is when we see film mentioned and the growth in that and the great potential that seems to have for our city. And I just reflect on a feature film that occurred in the community in which I live, and the way that supported a small community, be it the community hall that got money for being rented, or a colleague whose house was improved and made warmer because it was used for filming. So film isn't just at a really high level, it impacts on local people in such positive ways. I'm delighted to see this activity in the last quarter and look forward to the next report.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a couple of comments about paragraph 11 in the report, which speaks to the 2017-18 Dunedin energy study, which reports a 5% increase in energy use year on year and a 6% increase in greenhouse gas emissions in the city at a time when we need that trajectory to start heading in the opposite direction. And I know at the same time, we've seen The Guardian this week announce that they're reporting concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere as part of their weather reporting, which I think is sound, and I encourage others to do the same, maybe directly after the business news. The economic development strategy obviously is focused on growth in terms of job numbers in the city and growth in terms of GDP in the city. And at the time it was adopted, we asked how it would be considered, the environmental implications of those initiatives that would be supported through the economic development strategy. And we were told that the environment strategy was there to provide the tension, because everything we were going to do as a city and as a council was to give effect to our strategic framework in its entirety. And there in our environment strategy we have an ambition to be a net zero carbon city, but as we've heard at the public forum today at this meeting, at the very least we're not reporting back on what we're doing in terms of delivering against our environment strategy, if not making inadequate progress in that area. And the urgency felt in our community, particularly by our young people, isn't something that we can ignore. We've got very little time to do the planning and investment now if we're to get on a trajectory towards decarbonisation by 2030, which is where the best science now tells us that we need to get to. And how is this relevant to economic development? I'm so glad you asked. There's a great paper put out by the New Climate Economy. Their report last week set out something in the order of 40 trillion New Zealand dollars globally to be saved were we to invest more aggressively in sustainability in terms of how we're shaping our economies in the very short term. And so I think that is something we need to bear in mind here locally. It's certainly worth celebrating the progress that we're making in terms of our local economy, and that's outlined, and the breadth of that is outlined in this report, but those short-term gains will be meaningless if we don't equally invest in a more concerted effort in terms of looking after our natural environment, because this is the single biggest economic risk that we face, and as such it needs to be treated as more than a footnote in our reporting on economic development. So I'll raise a couple of things under items for notification of the Chair that will give effect to that, but I just wanted, it's great to see paragraph 11 in this report in terms of the discussions that are going on around the energy work and the energy plan, but it's kind of behoving on us to elevate that to a more urgent level. Thanks.
In that case, your right of reply. In that case, we'll put it to the vote. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. That brings us to items for consideration by the Chair. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would request a report, not necessarily to this committee, but a committee with some urgency outlining progress against the initial actions in Te Aotearoa, the environment strategy, as has been mentioned as part of the public forum, but also a paper to come to council or committee asking whether or not this body would endorse the climate emergency declaration as has been proposed by the public forum.
Councillor O'Malley.
I'd like to add to that report, if possible, the economic impacts of moving our carbon neutral dates from 2050 back to 2035 to be considered in that report as well.
Any Councillor Vandervis.
Is this proposed report something that we get to vote on? Is it something that might lie around for 2 years before it happens? What's the process from here on?
Well, I would hope that the report then generates an opportunity for us as councillors to decide where to from there.
So you're saying that a request to the Chair by 2 councillors for a report means it's actually going to happen?
I will be asking staff if that can be done, yes. And we do have a paper, we have been asked to generate a paper that brings before us the climate emergency resolution. So there will be some...
Who's asked us?
Came through the public forum. It's been asked for by Councillor Hawkins.
So if I'm to understand it, the process now is that anyone that shows up at a public forum can get a paper generated and a report here that's going to happen because 2 councillors requested of the Chair. This seems to me to be an extraordinary process, especially considering the difficulty of having a report request that's actually unanimously decided by all councillors. How is this new process justifiable?
I don't think this is a new process. Chairs get asked for items for their consideration.
Certainly.
I have given it my consideration. I will discuss it with the Chief Executive, and from there we'll either have a paper or we won't, and the timing of that will be dependent on when staff can get to it.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to hear that you now suggest that we may not get a paper. Your answers before indicated that it was actually a happening thing, but thank you for clarifying.
Councillor Elder.
Just a question on process, really. So do we need to move that these reports be accepted, or do we have to have a motion on that effect?
I think we can't at this point move it, but
Yes.
it doesn't stop. So if it came to the case that there was a reluctance to put a paper up, it doesn't stop a councillor proposing a notice of motion. So it would come to us through some other avenue.
Okay, I was just wanting to clarify process, really. Thank you.
Okay, with that out of the way, I will now move that the meeting moves into non-public for the reasons outlined in the agenda, and we will take I will also move that we take a 5-minute adjournment. Seconded, Councillor Lord. All in favour? Done.